always told my students, I'm fortunate. I'm a foreigner. You'll go and try and understand the language because you'll recognize it as Japanese. How do you think emotion gets shown in Noh if the mask is by stamps, by certain stamps of the feet? You might have this mask, but all of a sudden, it's very quick turn of the face. Yo, then gets yo.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, subscribing is the best way to support us. It helps us grow and bring you new stories from life in Japan. All right, let's jump in. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today I have the pleasure to welcome Richard Emmert. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
You're a Noh specialist,
yes.
a type of theater, or not theater, depending on who you ask. We were just talking about this, and we will get into the classification of this very traditional art form here in Japan, and cover your decades of experience working with this. You've co-written these two beautiful books. We've got the Intercultural Japanese Noh Theater, as well as a book about Noh and Kyogen masks, which is very, very beautiful. And we will talk about them too.
Okay, great.
But before we get into all of this, what I'm curious about is what brought you to Japan in the first place?
Oh, boy. My family hosted a Japanese woman when I was in the 8th grade in the United States. We hosted a Japanese woman to stay with us for a year. And I had 2 older sisters, and she was just... her age was just in between the ages of my 2 sisters. And we actually didn't think that she had written a letter to our home in Ohio, presumably for Ohayo gozaimasu for some reason. And my parents had taken a newspaper in which had the letter, and my mother wrote back and said, she won't write to us because, let's not get up our hopes up. But she did, and came and stayed with us for a year. Thereafter, my parents came to Japan. And so it was in the back of my mind. Before that, I was actually very interested in going abroad. And I thought about various places where I wanted to go. Actually, I was thinking I wanted to go to Africa, but my brother had been there. And I was taking French for some reason, and this was when my first year of college, and I really didn't like the French teacher. So in the end, I do like to tell people the reason I came to Japan was because I didn't like the French teacher. So I ended up knowing that there was a very good Japanese program at the college. I was going to Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. And so my brother, who had been to Japan, said, well, you should try and get into that program. It's very interesting. So I thought, well, I'll go there for 6 months. Maybe I can still go to Africa for 6 months. But when I applied, they said, actually, if you apply for a full year, you have a better chance of getting in. And I said, okay, I'll do that.
At that point, you had kind of a relation with Japan already through your parents, but you had never been there yourself.
I had never come, no.
And you decide to drop the French side and put aside your interest for Africa to, okay, let's try the Japanese course for you.
And of course, this was right at the time of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of interest in Asia. In Vietnam, of course, and Vietnam and Japan are very different. But there was that interest in Asia as well, too. And so it was a small college, but it was one of the few places where you could study about Japan. And there was a history professor who started the international division at Waseda University. And so it was at that time that I decided, okay, I would come here for a year. And that's basically it. Yeah.
You did enroll for a year, but here you are many years later and still into Japan. So what was it during that first year that kind of got you hooked in a way that you decided to pursue your studies?
Well, actually, it was before I came, I actually took a seminar in Noh. And of course, that seems quite strange because this was a long time ago, to have a seminar by a theater professor and a music professor who had both spent time in Japan, because at Earlham College, they were the history professor who had started bringing over various professors in the college to come to, bringing them to Japan for short stays of a couple of months, for example. And so both of them had come for maybe even longer, for half a year each, I think, at least. And then they wanted to give this seminar because the theater professor had written a No in English. And he had asked the music professor to write music that suggests No for that. And I didn't plan to take this, but my best friend said, "What are you doing?" I was taking theater, I was doing music, various things. And he said, "What's wrong with you? You're going to Japan. You have to take this." And I said, "But there are other things I'm taking. I'm so busy in doing all the other things," because I already knew I was going to be gone for a full year. And I wanted to take a number of courses that, I would need to take. But somehow I said, okay, I'll squeeze that in too. And after that, I was, there were a number of things that happened as a result of that, but I came to know about No, and then after that came to Japan, and during that year, I saw No several times, and not to say I got hooked right away. That didn't really happen until I came back a couple of years later after I had already graduated, and
So you kind of decided to enroll in that seminar, and you were explaining just now that the theater professor wrote a play,
right?
But also before we started recording, you explained to me that some people are not so on board with the idea of calling No theater. So for people that are not too familiar, what exactly is it, and how would you describe it?
No is a 650-year-old classical Japanese stage art. It's performed on stage. Many people call it theater, refer to it as No theater. There's some people who don't want to use the term theater and just call it No, because it's definitely not realistic theater, which we tend to have in the West. Instead, it's sort of a stage form that you have stylized movement, music. You could say it's a kind of musical theater, but the vocal technique is very different from, say, opera or musicals in the West. But I mean, I guess you could call it more of a musical stage art.
And what were your first impressions of this stage art when you enrolled in that seminar?
Well, and I've talked about it a number of different places. And so some people know about it. It's written down in various places. And that is to say, I knew nothing about it. But my best friend said, we have to take this class. So we sat in the seminar, and there were probably 20, 25 people in the seminar and the two professors. And the music professor put on a record of No. And so this is No's, a record, obviously the music of it. This was before there were DVDs or before it was easy to just show a film, for example, in class, or video in class. And so we did eventually see a film of No, but there weren't many films of No available. So then we just listened to this recording. And one thing that is very distinctive about No is its use of what we call drum calls. In Japanese, it's kakegoe. Kake means to throw out. Goe or koe, throwing your voice. And it's actually used in a lot of Japanese, for example, folk music forms and whatnot. But it's highly stylized in Noh. And just to give you an idea, and I'll back away from the mic just a little bit so it doesn't get too loud. Yo, oh, for example.
That is very
just
unique.
To give an example of how the voice is used. Well, something like that we heard it. And that was my first time to hearing it, hearing it. And this friend and I were sort of sitting at the back, and it seemed like everyone else, I don't really know this, but it seemed like everyone else had either heard this before or contained themselves a little bit more. The two of us just sort of broke out laughing because we heard this, and we heard this in the music. And I'd done a lot with music anyway, but to hear the voice being used in that way, it just, was just very surprising for me. And I think we hid this pretty well, but later on, I know the professors made some decisions about how we performed on stage. And in a typical Noh performance, those people who do the drum calls, who do the kakegoi, they sit at the back of the stage, but they're very prominent. You can see them right at the back of the stage. But instead, we put them in a kind of orchestra box and put them down so they wouldn't be seen. And I think there was a fear that maybe people would start laughing like the two of us had done at the beginning of the seminar.
I think this is probably a reaction that many people that are not familiar with Noh have when they hear this for the first time. You explained that these voices are stylized. So I imagine depending on the sounds you make, it communicates something very specific. Is that correct?
Well, it does set an atmosphere. Mm-hmm. People ask, what are they saying? What are they saying? Well, they're not saying, they're saying yo, ho, ho, yoi. Those are the four kinds of drum calls. And so, I've done this in presentations I've made. I remember doing it for a high school in the UK. And a couple of people started really laughing, and they couldn't control themselves. I said, that's all right. I said, the same thing happened to me. And then I went on and became a specialist in it. So maybe that will happen to you too. And so I told this guy that. But I don't think he did. But
so you get curious about Noh, but not hooked right away. First, you go to Japan for the first time. How was your experience arriving to Japan? I think it was in the 70s that you first came.
1970, yes.
Exactly.
Yes. No, I really liked Japan. And sure, there were things that were very, very different. People say, well, were you surprised about this or that or the other? Well, yeah, I have some stories of being surprised at certain things, but maybe one of the biggest surprises about sort of cultural differences was when I went back to the United States. Mm-hmm. I always feel like, and I've read from time to time the mention of people who go abroad. You expect things to be different, and you're interested in it. It's exciting when things are different. When you go back, all the things that you thought that this is what happens with us, but then when you go back, all of a sudden you look at things in a different way, and that sometimes is more of a sort of a cultural.
The reverse culture shock hit you harder than moving here.
Shock.
But that year, the first year you spent here was interesting enough for you to want to come back.
Well, yes. And one thing that I've been doing a lot of musical kinds of things. And so my intent when I came to Japan was to do some kind of Japanese music. And I had a professor, I was at Waseda International Division is where I was. And I had spoken to him. He was Japan's probably foremost ethnomusicologist, and he taught at another university, but he was coming to just teach part-time at Waseda. And I mentioned to him that I'd done some Noh and everything, and mentioned all of that, but I wanted to do an instrument. And since I had done I'd studied, guitar, folk guitar that I taught myself, and then later on actually studied some classical guitar. I thought I would do some sort of string instrument.
Mm-hmm.
But he brought a shakuhachi to class.
The flute?
Yes. Shakuhachi is a vertical flute. And I had played clarinet and saxophone and recorder, various things, all with embouchures, different from anything like a shakuhachi. But I decided to, he said, this is a very difficult instrument to play. Anyone who would like to try the instrument after class, please come up. And he talked about himself going to India when he was younger by boat and taking a shakuhachi with him and every day practicing it and kind of getting a sound out of it eventually when he got over there.
It is very difficult.
It's very difficult. Yeah. And so I went up and tried it and got a sound out of it right away. And he said, oh, no, you shouldn't do another instrument. You should study shakuhachi. And I had just learned about shakuhachi that day. And I said, let me think about it. And eventually I said, okay, I'll do shakuhachi. And he introduced me to probably one of the foremost shakuhachi players in Japan, a man named Yamaguchi Goro. And Yamaguchi Sensei. And so I started studying with him. And so I ended up studying for about 8 months in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that was in my background. But then I was also interested in seeing other kinds of things. And so I went to Noh, and we also went to Kabuki, for example. And maybe most people have heard of Kabuki rather than Noh, or might have an image of that a little bit more than Noh. So I went to that and saw some other performances, this and that and the other. And then when I came back to Japan, I by chance met a Noh actor and
that's
started doing Noh.
It's a very unique art form. You kind of briefly explain how it is, and you just brought up Kabuki, which maybe more people are familiar with. How would you compare both of them? Are they actually even from the same era? Did they develop in the same circles, or what are the
Well, first of all, Noh is older. Noh is probably in its more close to its present form from around 600 to 650 years old. That's generally what is said. Kabuki was founded a little bit more at the Edo period, which is around 1600. And it developed over 100 years or so, and then over time, things change, certainly, but it is more known as. So while Noh became the sort of performing art of the samurai class and daimyo, the lords of various provinces at that particular time. Many of them had Noh groups as well. While Kabuki ended up being the art of sort of the merchant class, and Kabuki tends to be, it's stylistic, but on the spectrum of stylism to realism, it's some way halfway down. While Noh is very much on the sort of stylistic side of everything, I would say Kabuki is kind of in between. Mm-hmm. It has dance pieces and it has stylized movement patterns, but it also has a much more sort of realistic kind of side to it. And the way the stories are presented tend to be a little bit more like Western theater. In some ways, I think people might maybe want to not agree with that.
A little bit.
Yeah, but certainly compared to Noh, in which the stories are presented in quite different ways, I think. And so that's one big difference between the two. Maybe should I talk about that?
We will get into this.
Yeah.
You mentioned that historically Noh is a bit older, but also was something that was more, let's say, for the elite of the time, the samurai class and the daimyo, compared to Kabuki.
It's true.
What are the origins of this theater? How did it kind of come to be there?
Okay. So, in fact, it is much older than that. And there were performances that were done. I mean, the roots go back to something that came over from China, which was something called Sarugaku. And Sarugaku seemed to be kind of acrobatic, certain things that started developing plays as well. And so this is already, say, the 8th century or so. And later on, I think people think that there were changes made, and somewhere, for whatever reason, it was more or less in the 14th century that change started being, well, I should say even before that, there were a lot of performances at shrines and temples. And then that sort of taking on certain kind of religious characteristics as well, too. And it was after that the stories started becoming a little bit stronger. And that is what happened in the 1300s, in the 14th century. And someone known as Kanami was his name. And he had a son, Zeami. And Zeami is the person who is generally considered today as more or less the father of Noh. So Kanami was the father of Noh's father.
I see.
And Kanami actually also took in some other musical elements that were very popular also at the time. And so this is where Noh was actually first called at that time as Sarugaku Noh, is what it was. And so Sarugaku Noh kind of developed, and it wasn't actually until the late 1800s that it would be known specifically as Noh. And so that's a fairly recent kind of thing.
Stories are at the core of every play. Where do these stories come from? You mentioned there was a religious component. Are they typically, how can I put this? Commoner stories of like daily life? Are they more like mythical stories about deities, or like what kind of stories and where do they come from?
It's interesting over time, and in Zeami's time, there were considered to be 9 different categories, but it was really in the Edo period when they talked about having 5 categories. And those categories of plays were first about gods. That was the first category play. Second category play was about warriors, specifically about the Civil War, about the Genji and the Heike from the 12th century, stories from both sides of that. And then you had women plays, and tended to be very beautiful younger women who might have who died maybe when they were young, but oftentimes much older, and their spirits come back. And actually, that's what warrior plays are too. A lot of times the spirits of warriors come back. And so that's the second category. The third category, women plays. A fourth category was a little bit more of a dramatic side, where the main character was someone living in the present, was not a spirit, of someone living in the present. And these included Chinese plays, or also plays that you might, one term because it stuck out a little bit, and that was the term where I have some friends who really don't like this. It was called Mad Women plays. But the reason they had become crazed was because they had a child who was taken or kidnapped or disappeared for whatever reason. And most of those plays, in the end, mother and child are reunited. And so they're not really, in that sense, I mean, it's a very good story, but then there is one in particular, perhaps the most well-known place, where the mother travels all the way from the capital, which at that time was Kyoto, all the way down to what is now Tokyo, but then was not. It was the Sumida River is right beside the present day Tokyo. And that is called Sumidagawa is the name of that play. And so she traveled over for a full year and arrived at the Sumida River on the very day when the local people were having a memorial for a child who had died a year before, had been brought there by slave traders. And of course, she finds out it was her child. And that child then appears, the spirit of that child appears, and she tries to grab it and can't. So it ends at a very, very sad note. And that's kind of well known in opera circles because Benjamin Britten, a British composer, came to Japan in the 50s, saw that particular play, and went back and wrote, had a play written, and then he wrote the music for something he called Curlew River. And Curlew River was a made-up name of a river in
the UK.
In the UK.
Interesting.
And so the story was very similar, but one big difference, it was Christian and its sort of background in the whole thing. And so in the end, the child does appear, but the child says, "Don't worry, mother, we'll meet again in heaven." Whereas Sumidagawa, there's nothing like that.
The end.
The child just disappears, and it's very Buddhist, and the mother goes away very sad. And so at the end of such plays, you can go outside and people are in tears and stuff like that. It's really quite
so very dramatic,
place.
Very moving. And
it's very moving.
Quite a few categories of plays, as you just
yes,
described.
And so that was the fourth category.
The fourth,
place.
and there's
fourth
five more.
Is one where you just kind of put anything in that category that doesn't belong in the other categories. A more dramatic kind of side to it. Fifth category plays are sometimes demons, and but then there are a couple in there that aren't really demons either. Shishi, for example, lion. So that's completely different. So certain plays that are kind of proper for ending a program. Because in the Edo period, these 5 categories, in fact, performances of Noh would have a play in each category.
I see.
In between, there would be a kyogen or comic play. And they have kind of categories too, but kyogen plays are a little bit more sort of humorous plays with a lot of times a lord and a servant or something. And,
to alleviate the mood in the audience a little bit.
And where the servant takes advantage of the lord or something like that. The lord is really kind of stupid. The servant points out that stupidity and that kind of thing. So there are a number of things. It's interesting because the Noh plays, people know who wrote many of those. I mean, not all of them, but certainly 60 or 70% of them. Maybe there's an awareness as to who wrote these plays, where the kyogen plays, no one knows who wrote any of those.
Is there a set number of Noh plays, or is it kind of something in development nowadays? People are still writing new ones, or
well, certainly, some people say as many as 3,000 have been written. But what is generally considered the present repertory of Noh is around 240 plays. Present repertory of Kyogen, I think, is around 270 or 280. Now, it doesn't mean that all those plays are actually performed regularly. Many of them are, but presumably though that official repertoire are plays that could be performed, even though even now some of those are rarely performed. But yeah.
So these performances are played by a certain number of actors, and your kind of life took a turn in a way when you got to meet one of those actors in Tokyo. Can you tell me about that encounter and kind of how that gave you new perspectives on this stage performance?
Well, first of all, the encounter was kind of interesting in itself because I told you about this play. Well, I didn't really tell you about the seminar that eventually put on the play by the theater professor at Earlham College. Mm-hmm. And he had written a play called St. Francis. And so we had been in the seminar, and he wanted people who were in the seminar, not everyone joined in, but people who wanted to possibly be in that play. And I do remember the sort of, he had a kind of tryout for that. And he told everyone to walk around slowly is what he did, because a lot of stylization of Noh is kind of done in a slow manner. He asked people to walk around slowly. I was chosen to be the lead actor in that piece, so I tell people that I must have walked around the slowest. I don't know if I did. But we did that, and then we were asked to do the performance. We did it probably I think we did it in April, actually, a performance. And then we were asked to do it at graduation again. At our performances in April, I thought that was the end of it. But then all of a sudden, they asked us to do it again a couple of times at graduation. And not only that, afterwards, they asked us to stay on so they could film it. And so they had gotten money to make a film of this play called St. Francis, based on the life of Francis of Assisi. And so there was a film. What happened when I had come back to Japan in 1973, this is my second time, and I was just back. I had only been back for a couple of months. And I happened to see in an English newspaper that the film was going to be shown. I had known a copy of the film had made its way to Japan. Wow. And a theater writer for the Japan Times had this copy. And he was going to, his name was Don Kenny, and he was going to show this for an international women's club. I happened to see that it was being shown. And of course, I'm the lead character in that. And I thought, well, I'm going to go see it. I had actually seen it when I had been back in, after I'd spent a year in Japan and gone back to Earlham College. But here was a copy was here in Japan. And I thought, okay, I'll see about going to see it. And it was at the Keio Plaza Hotel in Tokyo. Oh. And I went and asked, I said, I'm actually in the film. And they said, well, yeah, you can just sit in the back, and maybe at the end of the talk, we can introduce you. And so at the end of the talk, I was introduced to Don Kenny, and he said, oh, you were in this play? And I said, well, yes, I was. And he said, were you the flute player? I said, no, I was the main actor. And I used to tell him that, yeah, I remember him being, the main actor. Kind of
disappointed.
Disappointed. And he said, no, I wasn't disappointed. But in fact, I mean, he told me at that point, he said, actually, I'd like to do that play in Japan, here in Tokyo. And he said, could you teach the music to people? And I said, yes, I know the play. I could definitely teach the music to people. But then I was thinking very quickly, but here I am in Japan. If I'm going to teach something about No, I really should study No myself.
Professionally, in a way.
Yeah, well, from somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, I know a young actor. And so he ended up introducing me to this man named Akira Matsui, who's several years older than me at that point. And I still is, but I should say. And and he, and I was his student. I became his student, started taking lessons from him.
I did read that the actors typically belong to sort of like No family. That there are these kind of main families that have like slightly different styles of No.
Yeah.
Is that still the case today?
Family is a little you might be misunderstood from it. There are indeed families that are quite old, but more you can say they are what we call schools or ryu. And so school, not meaning a school building, but a style. And so there are also 5 schools of main actors.
Okay.
This is the main actor. He's called a shite actor. And so they're the main performers, but also the members of the chorus. And so they, everyone belongs to a school, but in fact, there are schools there's a second actor, the waki, a kyogen actor, and then the 4 instrumentalists. So altogether, there are 7 sort of categories of schools, and there's something like 23 schools.
How does it work if the main actor comes from one school and the second actor comes from a different school, and then the kyogen performer from another school? If they are to make a play together, don't they need to kind of practice a similar style, a similar approach to the story? Your
training is that. That's what you do in your training. You learn, and then professional people who are on the professional track start studying really a lot of the singing. And of course, doing a lot with movement as well, too. And so you study that. But then you also study the instruments. And if you've studied the instruments from one of the schools, that generally helps you understand the principles of how the instruments fit with the singers. And is what becomes very, very important. The thing is, though, the main actor really stands out the most. And then you have the waki actors, and they, like I say, they have 3 schools too. And each of the kyogen has 2 schools and everything. But over time, they perform, and there are some differences between those schools, but they always reconcile those differences when they're performing. The person in one school will say, well, this is the way we do it, and you begin to learn all of that. But for the most part, in principle, they do the same kinds of things. But they do them, you'll get used to them, and you hear them, the way they chant. Maybe some of their movement is a little bit different, but
the core principles are the same.
Exactly.
And the technique and the level of performance you get allows you to adapt to either way.
Right.
So
indeed,
you meet Matsui-san?
And I meet Akira Matsui, yes.
And what happens then? What does he teach you that was maybe new or different from kind of the early learnings you had?
I should say that I'm not exactly on the professional track.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of his amateur students, because even particularly back in the 70s, there were really a lot of, most professionals had a number of amateur students. And you could say that they probably made most of their money, their living, through teaching amateurs. I mean, they also performed professional in professional performances, but they were teaching amateur students. And so, for example, I generally had 3 lessons a month for my chant and dance with Akira Matsui. And he wasn't actually living in Tokyo. He was living in Wakayama by that time. He had moved back down to Wakayama. He had been up in Tokyo when he was younger. And then once he became full professional, he went back to Wakayama and was teaching. But by that time, the Shinkansen was there, and he was going back and forth. And every month he would come up to Tokyo. Then eventually I started taking instruments in the various, lessons in the various instruments as well too. And so I first started with the Noh flute, and then the other 3 instruments are all drums, pointing out how important rhythm is in all of this. And so I was taking what is called the shoulder drum, and then after a couple of years, I started taking the sort of side drum, the kotsuzumi, the otsuzumi, and then a stick drum called the taiko. And so I was taking all of those.
So 4 different instruments,
yes,
and also the vocals.
Vocals and movement. So that's both movement and chant.
You gave us a demonstration earlier of those vocals. It's very specific. How do you kind of get to practice?
Now, to clarify, the example I gave you was not the chant, but was part of the drum calls. Mm-hmm. And so that is what's really unique, and I didn't really explain that fully. And that is the drummers, when they play, for example, the shoulder drum, is hitting the drum and doing the drum call in between. And so that's sort of creating the atmosphere of it. Again, yo, ho, and hitting the drum. The other drum comes in. And the way they combine and the way they perform with the chant becomes quite interesting in terms of rhythm and structure, quite unique in many ways.
You described the pacing as slow, and a lot of it goes through slow movement. And that was the advice your teacher gave you back at Earlham College, right? Whatever you do, just do it slowly. How and where does this come from, and what is this pace trying to convey?
Well, it's not all slow. And that's the thing. It's intense. And so it's not slow, relaxed. It's slow, intense, I should say. And so the intensity is something that builds up this energy and almost, to the point of explosion. And so often there is a concept known as yooooooooo that originally came over from China, was used in this other form called gagaku, or court music. But Noh really used it in many different ways. But musically, in its simplest form to understand, jo means sort of a slow beginning. Ha means the development, meaning it speeds up. And Q means fast. And so you're speeding up at the end, yooooooooo. And how that is done, sort of on a slow line of yooooooooo, or much more intense kind of form. And a lot of that comes through the instruments as well. And so there is this energy. It's a quiet energy a lot of the time. But then this quiet energy is what builds up. And that slow buildup comes, and then it becomes, in a sense, the climax of the play. So there's always this intensity. And this is the thing that I first noticed with Akira Matsui, because, if I think back on what my first lessons were with him, I remember being surprised, because I was always taking a tape recorder at the time, a small little tape recorder I had to record him singing. And I just felt a vibration in the room. And later on, when I listened to the recordings, I was getting this vibration coming through, and I was quite surprised that the tape recorder was that good in the first place. But I felt it in the room. And so that's that's the other thing. How the intensity of that kind of chant is done. I mean, can I give you a couple examples?
Yes, please.
Okay. For example, maybe what is particularly unique about no chant is that you have something that in my school we call wa gin, and that is generally translated when I write about it in English as melodic chant or melodic singing. And that's in some ways fairly close to what you might have a melody. It's just that the intensity is a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Irawa katsurano ashibashiram. That's one, and you can tell there are different pitches.
It kind of goes
and it
down,
even goes Tachi idete mine no kumo. So those are the sort of main melodic areas that you have. Three, maybe you can talk about a fourth one or even extra lows sometimes, a fifth one, but it's generally the three that are the main melodic areas that you have. So that's in this melodic singing style. But there's also what we call go-gin. Go means strong, or we generally call it dynamic chant or dynamic singing.
Okay.
Tako sango ya skono rabune ni. Sorry, I just lost my sorry, I can't think of how that goes. But let me sing what I just sang melodic style. If that was sung in dynamic style, it would sound different.
Okay.
Irawa katsurano ashibashiram.
It really comes from inside.
Yeah, where before I was singing melodically. Irawa katsurano ashibashiram. So there you have this slight sort of, it's fairly big difference, I think, but this melodic style and dynamic style, then the quality of the voice.
And so when you were studying with Matsui-san, this kind of really struck you, that the power, the intensity of what he was doing. But at the time, you're still kind of new to all of this. You're curious, you're interested. You ended up dedicating your life to studying this art form in a way, writing books and sharing that knowledge. Was it just a kind of gradual, a kind of rabbit hole you dug yourself into? Or was there a moment where you were thinking, no, I really want to learn this more. This is something I want to do?
No. Actually, at the very beginning, I thought, I'm going to be doing this for 2 years. And that's what I'll do. And, you do it for 2 years. And you realize that you get a little bit better. I didn't think I was going to really dedicate my whole life to it. But by that time, I was also at Tokyo Geijutsu Daikaku, the Tokyo University of Fine Arts and Music. And I was there now at a Japanese university studying with this very well-known ethnomusicologist, but also other professors, and one being perhaps one of the most important professors about No. He was also teaching there, Yokomichi Mario. And so I was taking classes there, and I remember first taking those classes, and all the classes then, at first, all of a sudden I had been in Japan before, but those classes at the international division were generally in English.
Mm-hmm.
But then now at Tokyo Geisha Dayaku, I was there at, taking classes in Japanese. And so you're doing all of this. And the first year I took classes with Yokomichi Mario. But after a year, then a second year, I wanted to go back because I realized, and I'd heard about this, that each year what he teaches are completely different. Everything is different each year. And so I started taking whatever classes I could from him, even if I wasn't taking it for credit. I was just sitting, in the classes.
Just to absorb all the knowledge.
Yeah. And so from the second year, all the Japanese started coming up to me, what was he talking about here, and stuff. By that time, I had been taking no lessons for a couple of years. And so there were a lot of Japanese asking me about about that. And I was telling them, by that time, my Japanese was starting to improve. Talk about that. And so it was a little bit like a rabbit hole. I mean, you realize you're getting a little bit better. After 3 or 4 years, some people, Akira Matsui was occasionally going abroad or doing something for foreigners. He said, would you come and translate for me? I guess maybe after 4 or 5 years, he was in the States for a short time teaching, and I was going to be in the States too. He said, please come and he had already gone to the States and Canada and had someone translate for him. But he said, you would do a much better job of translating because you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started doing things like that. And then other Noh actors here asking me to translate for them, for example.
He was taking this a little bit overseas. You were studying it at university with a professor and having Japanese students also come to you. How popular of an art form is this? Is it something that maybe now the younger generation is regaining interest into, or is it something that is maybe struggling to keep people coming to fill the audience seats?
Well, I would say in the 70s, in the early 80s, there were a lot of, and I think I mentioned this already, and that is there were a lot of amateur students. And so I was taking those lessons all outside of the university.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the university I was going to had a program for people who were going to go into the Noh world. But I wasn't in that program. I was in the general sort of music theory division. But I was taking all the lessons outside. In fact, that was recommended to me because, in fact, I could take lessons the whole year around. And so I was taking lessons. At that point, I was still taking lessons in shakuhachi. I was then taking Noh lessons. And then I also started joining the utai or chant group that was at the university. I took that. I took lessons in flute, and then the 3 drums, kotsuzumi, otsuzumi, and taiko. So each of those, the flute was actually my teacher was giving me. He said, come to my house too. And so he would give me 6 lessons a month. Well, 5 or 6 lessons a month. So I had lessons almost all the time, and I was still taking classes at the university. So, all of that was part of this sort of my own process of going down that rabbit hole, in a sense. But I would say at that time, there were just a lot of amateurs, and all my teachers would have student recitals. And in those student recitals, I would meet other teachers in the professional world from different schools. And so I was meeting a lot of different people. A lot of the other students were studying in other different schools, and I got to know a lot of them. And we actually had amateur groups that were performing too. And we were performing not only my school, which was the Kita school, but we were also performing like in the Kanzei, which is the largest school, mm-hmm. or the Hosho school. And all of these different schools then kind of mixed together. And some of them were studying different different schools of the instruments as well, too. And you start to learn all of that.
In the 70s, a relatively large and diverse community of people interested.
Yeah. And then one big difference that might have happened was in 1983 when the National Noh Theater was made. And the National Noh Theater then started having performances every month. They weren't a lot. They still only have maybe 5 performances a month that they sponsor. But those performances started drawing in larger audiences. And so you would think that would sort of increase a lot of them. But what really happened, I think gradually through the late 80s and particularly into the 90s, the number of amateurs started dwindling and the number of people who came to performances started increasing. And so where you had people, for example, we talked about Noh and Kabuki, and you had people I might have meet, and they might say, oh, I like Kabuki, but I don't like Noh. I don't go see Noh performance. Usually Kabuki and Bunraku, for example, in Osaka, a lot of people go to both of that because they tend to have similar stories. One is puppets, of course, but the puppets, not for children, but for adults. And so that Kabuki and Bunraku are quite similar in many, many ways. But Noh is older. But, I think in the 90s, and I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but I remember in the 70s and 80s when I first started taking something, I would kind of translate this idea of Noh theater. And at first use the term for theater, which is engeki, for example. And you might ask someone who's talking Japanese, Noh toyu engeki, that the theater known as Noh. And so you use the word engeki. And people would say, at that time, people would say, Noh isn't engeki. Well, if it's not the theater, what is it? Noh it's Noh. It's not engeki, is what people said. But then in the 90s, actually, I think, is when a book came out that someone wanted to deal with this and wanted to call engeki a kind of a stage art. And so, Noh toyu engeki. The engeki, or theater known as Noh, is the way, and this came out in Japanese, with this idea that, in fact, Noh can be considered theater if you think about it. So that goes against what I had said earlier, but I think somewhere in the 90s, and I think this became a little more pronounced in the 2000s, and up till now, I think there's a lot of concern that a lot of professionals, compared to the 70s and 80s, where professionals were teaching many amateur students, that number has decreased considerably. There are still a few teachers that really have a lot of amateur students, but there are a lot more that don't have it now. So it has gone down.
It sounds to me that there's more like this national theater now and these kind of professional troupes that still perform in their theaters, but the community at large kind of shrunk a little bit.
Yeah. I actually, it's very interesting because the National Noh Theater, which has, as I said, about 5 performances a month, they still pretty much sell out all their performances because they have posters up around Tokyo in particular. And so the word gets out, it gets out in newspapers and everything. And their ticket prices are a little bit cheaper than but some of the best performances, there's still a lot of other performances at the National Noh Theater. I performed on the National Noh Theater stage because my teacher rented it one time, and we generally perform at the Kita Noh Theater in Tokyo. But there have been chances to perform other places because, as I said, I had teachers in other instruments as well too.
So the stage you perform on is actually also very specific. It has this very specific
Yes.
shape, and
Exactly.
I feel like it's kind of always the same, except for a few details that may change.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the size is pretty much the same. Basically, square pillars at each side. It's about, is it 3 meters? That sounds a little, 3 meters by 3 meters, and then a little bit back as well, and off to the side. And then a long bridgeway is what we generally call it in English, that goes off to the side. And so the audiences tend to sit on two sides, but then also in front over here. And so off to the side like that. Yeah.
You went overseas with Matsui-san to kind of explain and present as well a little bit about Noh. What is the interest in Noh overseas? We just talked about the community and the performance here. I feel like it's much lesser known overseas, and yet your first encounter with a Noh play was about Saint Francis, and you had this talking about this British writer as well that took the story of the Sumidagawa and kind of transformed it, and that seems to have recurred quite a few times. How popular is Noh overseas, and where exactly lies the interest?
Well, it's hard to talk about it being popular. I mean, but I think there are a lot of places that have shown interest, and I've certainly taught abroad. I haven't counted. 15 or 20 times I've been invited to various places. A lot of times the same place, but I've given workshops at a number of different, for example, generally at universities, United States and Canada, in the UK, and I've gone to France and performed there as well too. So.
And written a book, or co-written a book on intercultural Japanese, right? So these kind of foreign interpretations
are actually plays that have been written in English and then have been performed as Noh plays. And so one of the main things I do is I've composed music for a number of what I call English Noh plays. And they're composed in such a way that it's strictly with the music of Noh, meant to be performed in Noh style. And for example, we often have it performed with musicians who are Japanese musicians. Although there have been some foreign musicians who have developed over time that perform as well too. And so, we performed a number of what I call English Noh. And then more recently, during COVID, I started going to France because I had a student who then, during COVID, we started writing a play. He first wanted to do it in English. And I said, why don't you do it in French? And he said, but no one will perform. I said, I'll come over and we can have workshops and develop. And he got a grant for a couple of years, and we ended up doing the play and traveled around France. And so that probably was the first, what I would call really a Noh performance. And one thing is, I tend to be fairly strict of what I call English Noh. And I started a company in 2000 called Theatre Nohgaku. And we performed a number of plays. And at first, myself and then one other member of our company, David Crandall, also had spent time in Japan, and he has written music in Noh style as well, but he's more of a composer, and then he sort of composes, and we have another term sort of, what do we call it? Noh expansions or something. I think that is the term we generally use. And with that, there's a little bit more Western music, but a lot of the elements are still No style. But
how much modern interpretations of No are there? When we talked with Tove Björk about Kabuki, they are now also making modern takes and plays from anime and kind of having costumes that match and kind of reinterpret it that way. Is No sticking to those 230 stories you mentioned before, or are there like modern stories written about things that people could relate to in modern times?
There are new No plays, and particularly from the Meiji period. So this would be around the 1860s, maybe late 1860s, when No divorced from all the daimyo, the lords, and the samurai class and everything, and then had to fend for itself, basically. And over time, in the late Meiji, No started on its own. And during that time and going more into the 1900s, then there were, from time to time, new No plays. I wouldn't say there were a lot, but then the post-war period, that increased. And I would say generally right after the post-war, the No plays, that new No plays, would have been plays that would have been developed by sort of families that had a long history, but other people maybe not so much. But from the 90s or so, that started changing. There are more people writing new No plays, but they tend to be written in the same kind of poetic and grammatical language as the older plays. Now, there have been a few, but very few, experiments with using poetic with contemporary Japanese language. And I should say the English No plays that are presented in this book, for example, all use contemporary English. We don't go back to Shakespearean English or older or something of that nature.
You mentioned being quite strict about what can be considered an English No play. What are the kind of the rules of, if you follow this and this and this, it can be considered No? If you kind of cross this line, it will be a different form.
My own, and because I'm the main person who has written maybe the music for 12 different English No plays, and I'm in the process of doing a couple more now. And then one in French, and I should also say in Mexico City.
Wow.
This Sumidagawa that I did, I made an arrangement originally in English, but I've since made an arrangement in Spanish. And we haven't done a full performance of it yet, but we've done work in progress performance of it in Mexico City now a couple of times. But the English No plays, what I say is a No play is when it uses music that is strictly No and then can be performed by professionals who understand the rules of Hayashi, and that's basically what I follow. But clearly you have to make adjustments because the language is different. Not only the fact that it's contemporary language adds to sort of a little bit more classical language of No plays. Not that so much, but the Japanese language, the characteristics of Japanese language, the characteristics of English, for that matter, the characteristics of French, the characteristics of Spanish, they're all different. And so you have to take into account those characteristics. So in a sense, I feel if you can sing, you can somehow create a No play in that language. But you have to follow those characteristics. And I know enough about Japanese know that there's a lot of variation within that. So there are certain times that you can make that variation and still follow the rules of No. I mean, I always think about when I was creating this no version of Sumidagawa, Sumida River in English. When I first created that, we were going to tour it, and the Otsuzumi player I asked to come with us. I'd worked with him before, and he came over, and we went through the whole play, and he played it. And at the end, he said, "Oh, it's just the same as the Japanese." It really isn't just the same. There are a lot of adjustments that you make in terms of language. But from his perspective, it followed all the rules and it didn't suddenly go off in a completely different structure. But so that part is, yeah.
The music stays the same, the language changes, but at the core, No always wants to convey these emotions. And I think that brings a topic that we haven't talked about yet at all, but I wanted to say for a little bit, which is the masks.
Oh, okay.
Because in traditional theater, emotions are conveyed through facial expressions. They're conveyed through the actors' reactions and interactions with each other. But in No, everything is stylized, and they're all wearing specific and very characteristic masks. And I think those are the masks that people see when they see the posters of the National No Theater, and they're like, "Oh, this mask looks cool."
Or the post, or these books, for example.
A book, an entire book about those many masks.
Yes.
And some of them are very ancient. Some of them are kept secret from the public, but they're all very visually striking. Tell me a little bit about those masks and how are they made? Like, I don't even know where to start because I think there's quite a lot to say. But
there's a lot to say. First of all, I wanted to react to what you said because you started talking about emotion. And of course, because in the West, emotion gets shown through the face. That's what we generally think. How do you think emotion gets shown in No? If the mask is worn, you can't show it through the face.
The tone of the voice and...
Well, in fact, yes. I mean, I think the tone of the voice, the whole quality of everything. One thing that, again, I think probably it was Akira Matsui, because I've translated it for him so many times that, and other people as well too. But one of the things that he would say, well, you show the emotion by stamps.
By stamps?
By certain stamps of the feet.
Oh.
And that happens, I mean, you walk in a very special way. We haven't even talked about that. But you move in a special way. But you also have these stamps that you use in No. And they also can convey emotion. I wanted to say, he wanted to show that, actually, and of course, that's in the context of a play. And you're correct to say that the music, that the quality of, what the Hayashi does when the drum calls are very sort of quiet and and then gets all of a sudden it gets a lot stronger, a lot more powerful. How that conveys the power and the intensity that you get. And you get this intensity. I always think it's through the drum calls and everything, what the chorus sings and everything. But a lot of this, because it also comes through the shite, the main actor on stage. I always think, a lot of times people, he was just so wonderful as the shite. Behind all of that are the instrumentalists and the chorus.
Maybe the disappointment from Don Kenny.
They have to be really, really good. And then if the shite actor is half decent, he'll have a really good performance. That. But if they're not any good, it'll be really difficult for the shite to kind of create that power and intensity through that. But going back to the masks, what can you say about them? I would say, first of all, as masks go, and if you know about masks and masks throughout the world, there are actually masks many, many different places. Mm-hmm. But Noh masks are, first of all, made of wood and very delicately carved, and probably the most delicate. And it's very interesting. In some ways, a lot of these masks are extremely realistic.
Oh.
But that's the stylism, because they're masks. But if you really looked at them, I mean, look at this mask on that front page. That mask is one of these, this no actor, can you get your, and there. That mask is not of a Japanese. And that was the point of that. Oh. This is not a traditional mask. The mask maker, who is the mask maker featured in this book, he brought that mask to me because it was used in a play that we did in London. And I was going to go over to London, and I was going to take the mask with him. He brought that mask out. It was just really realistic, and it was just quite amazing. And that also makes me think of, I was in San Francisco one time at, I think, the University of San Francisco. And I had been asked to come to a class. And I had 5 or 6 masks with me, and I showed them to people. And one I have is Hanya with horns. Mm-hmm. And a question I often ask people, is this male or female? And people always right away say, oh, of course it's male, because it has horns. It looks very ferocious. Actually, it isn't. It's female.
Wow.
And one thing is that if you've ever seen pictures of traditional weddings in Japan, a lot of times they have a big white, the bride has a big white sort of, it looks sort of like a crown, but it's sort of a white covering at the top of her head. And this is called tsuno kakushi. Tsuno is horns. Kakushi is to hide. It's to hide her horns of jealousy. I mean, a little bit
interesting.
I don't know what you would call it, but I mean, presumably, sometimes, and I've heard people joke, oh yeah, my wife started getting very angry at me. And what do they say? They say, oh, she became very angry or something, a husband might say. But so in any case, I have masks like that. And so in San Francisco, I had a mask like that. And then I had a young woman's mask, sort of like the mask on the front cover. And that's not a present day woman's sort of realistic kind of, but you can see it. It really looks like someone's face. And there are a lot of photos in that particular book. But a young woman in this class at San Francisco said to me, because you have these faces. She had looked at the Hanya mask with the horns, and doesn't that look really, quite amazing or something like that? So that's another woman's mask, various kinds, several different kinds of women's masks. And she had looked at the mask with the horns, which generally people say, oh, that looks ferocious and everything. But she said, actually, the one that looks the scariest is the one that looks realistic. Because it looks like a person it looks like a real person whose face has been sliced off, And she said, to me, that looks more scary as a mask because it is so realistic in many ways. So
if those masks are not there to necessarily represent the emotions, are they representing specific characters in the storyline? Are they representing personalities of the character? How do these work?
Well, actually, the strongest masks that, for example, that Hanya that I mentioned, and then some other masks, are in fact tend to show strong emotions. But they're actually used for a very short period of time on stage because they can't be used for a long period of time. And so that's usually the second half of the play. And it's the Joha-kyu, the quicker ending, coming out and being very strong about movements, and then it ends.
So the actors change masks multiple times during the...
Oftentimes twice. Not always, but, And I should also say there are some plays where no one wears a mask.
Oh, really?
But the face itself becomes like a mask. So you don't show the face and showing emotion. That said, I mean, I have a different teacher now in Tokyo. And I remember one time where he saw pictures of himself. He said, I was showing too much emotion because he was doing a very strong movement, not in a full no, but a part of a no play was being performed without costume and mask. But he said he was showing his the emotional side too much. And I've looked at older pictures of me, sort of all of a sudden doing this very strong, but you really try not to show that when you, particularly in those plays. And actually, some actors will honestly admit it's difficult to play without a mask because sometimes those emotions sort of creep up, and you don't want that to do that. You want your face to become a mask, and that's what the name of it is. And when you're not wearing a mask, it's called hita men. Hita in this case means direct.
Okay.
Direct mask. What is the direct mask? Your face. That's what it is. So, but in any case, then to go back to your question, it's these that are kind of seem neutral, and Japanese will remark about. And even in Japanese, that sometimes, they're neutral or non-expressive, like a no mask or something like that. And then people in the no world say, no, a no mask can be very expressive. And it becomes expressive when you sort of change it. And through the emotion, again, I would say, created by the instruments and the chant, the music that is the background to this, or the chant of that individual. You might have this mask and someone who's just wearing that mask, but all of a sudden, this very quick turn of the face, so quick that it becomes, when it was just before that was being very sort of in one place and only moving very slight. But all of a sudden, sort of move.
The intensity again.
The intensity that comes through. And so what is thought about these kind of masks, they can be used for a longer part of the performance. And so the first half might be longer and, or even the second half. I mean, depending what kind of play it is, but masks that show too much sort of power or emotion or strength, it's very difficult to use them for a long period of time.
So with all this stylization of No as a stage art, from the movements, the masks, the chants, the music, how can people that are not familiar with it go and appreciate the art form and kind of maybe notice certain things? Oh, this is interesting because of, or this is what it means. I imagine it may make people shy away from it if it seems like, well, I'm going to sit here for however long the performance is, a couple of hours, and not understand anything, and have people making these unique vocal sounds that don't convey anything to me. How can people appreciate it more and kind of really go and experience this art?
Well, I would say in some ways it might be easier today than it was when I started out. Although the advantage I had was I was taking lessons. And, I would go to no performances where I had no idea of the story. But I was watching for the things that I was learning. how you move on stage, how different actors move around on stage. And so those are the things. I had that as something that I was aware of. And in that process, I recall thinking, oh, this is the story, And then afterwards, I had a small book, oftentimes very small, which which had a paragraph on all 240 plays or whatever. And then I went home and looked at it. And what I thought was the story was completely wrong, but I still appreciate it for what it is. One thing now is, first of all, there are a number of translations. And there is, for example, something online called Noh.com, which has the summaries of a number of plays. I've put out 6 volumes from the National Noh Theater of summaries of all 240 plays, instead of one paragraph of a book which I had written by a well-known British scholar in the, I think, probably early 50s, P.G. O'Neill. I remember the small book. You can still get it, probably. And it just had one paragraph on each play. But what I've done is put those now in 6 volumes. And each volume has around 40. All 6 total is 240. But and so now there are a lot of those. At the National Noh Theater in Tokyo, the plays that the National Noh Theater sponsors, they have monitors in the chairs now in front of them. And so those, you can put on the Japanese as it's being performed. You can put on contemporary Japanese, so a translation into contemporary Japanese of what's being performed, or you can put it on English.
Wow.
And then occasionally they do something else where they have Spanish and French and Chinese and Korean. And so they're doing that kind of thing. And so there are opportunities. But one thing I would say, it's definitely difficult for someone just to go see a play. And because most people think it's a play, it's theater, you'll just watch. But it's definitely difficult to take it all in one time. Oftentimes it takes a really special person. I had a friend who came and just was saying, but he was in the theater world, and another well-known Indian theater director came a number of years back, and I took him to the National Noh Theater. It wasn't a performance that had those
subtitles.
Subtitles yet, and but he said, Noh, I think, is a theater for other theater makers. They'll be deeply moved by it, but your average audience will not be. Is what his interpretation, and I think sometimes it's a fair point. And it's not an easy theater. It demands that you be involved. It's very difficult to just sit back and accept it.
Very difficult to kind of understand, but with everything we've heard today, certainly a lot easier to appreciate everything that kind of goes into this. Richard, we covered a lot of topics on Noh. Is there anything in particular that is important to you that we haven't really gone into so far? What should people take away from this and remember about Noh and maybe get curious about?
Well, I think there are many ways to appreciate. I mean, I look at the way Japanese appreciate. I mean, obviously, if you go to performances, there are many Japanese who now, print out something, or maybe they make copies from a book of the text. And I mean, if you know Japanese, you can get used to listening to what that is. And so people have the text and they'll follow along with the text, because a lot of times it goes that slowly. So a combination of sort of watching the text and doing that. But then, for foreigners going to see it, I think you have to be open to, first of all, I would say, we talked about the masks, sort of showing interest in what the masks are like. There are other people who are really interested in the costumes. The costumes are all really quite amazing. And I'll also say generally quite expensive as costumes go. How movement is done. And even though it's covered by these full costumes, really watch the feet and how the feet move on stage. And then, of course, how everything comes together there with the movement of particularly the main actor. But the chorus, the instrumentalists, the drum calls, all of it comes down, and how they create a kind of energy and intensity, and how that kind of gets passed through the main actors. And that's not easy to take in. And I would say, there are certainly a lot of Japanese. Because I taught at a university for quite a number of years. And, I've had students going to Noh performances. And I always told my students, I said, I'm fortunate. I'm a foreigner. And so when I first went to Noh, I didn't try and understand the language because I knew I would not understand the language. And that makes it easier for me. You'll go and try and understand the language because you'll recognize it as Japanese, but it's poetic and it's classical language. And you'll think, why don't I understand this? And I said, so it's easier for me. Why is it easier? Because then I take the language out of it. Don't try and understand the story like that, but then appreciate all these other aspects of whether it's the masks, or costumes, the whole sort of atmosphere of the stage, which in a sense almost is like, you might even think of it as a kind of religious experience, And so, keeping that in mind, because I know it's difficult for Japanese as well, too, going for the first time. Why do people continue? If you start seeing a number of performances, then you begin to, oh, okay. And then you look at, okay, this is this kind of story, and there's that story. And, other people will insist, oh, Kabuki is a lot more interesting, or sometimes there's the world of Noh as opposed to the world of Kyogen. Noh and Kyogen are performed traditionally on the same stage, but a lot of people like Kyogen a lot, and so there are a lot of issues, and I would say it's not easy, but there are people who over time, because for whatever reason, are able to get away from just expecting a Western theater play.
So approaching it with a lot of curiosity and observing what is going on stage, looking at the little details. And that's how maybe for people that don't know too much about it, they can get a good experience out of their first or second or third Noh play until they get curious enough to kind of go down the rabbit hole and maybe write a few books on the topic.
Right.
Richard, thank you so much for coming and sharing so much of your knowledge and your story in the world of Noh. It was really fascinating to hear about it. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye. Wow. That was super cool. That was super interesting. Thank you for sticking with us all the way till the end. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the podcast. It helps us improve the show and bring you more in-depth conversations from Japan. Take care and see you next time.